The processing for visas has apparently restarted. Can you talk about a little bit about process, what stalled it? India says it was a security issue with Canada.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, that's really the answer. Happy that it's happening. It shouldn't have happened in the first place, but we'll just have to wait and see. It's encouraging news for people that are looking to travel. But again, it's early days.
Information about what the security threat was that caused it.
I think, other than speculating about the security concerns that they've voiced publicly about their personal security in and around their missions, nothing more than that.
Minister, the FES has language about international students, about some sort of recognition program for institutions that provide housing. Are you thinking about explicitly tying international student permits to whether or not that institution can provide housing?
Well, what we announced a couple of weeks ago was really the beginning of a measure to make sure that we were doing our jobs federally, to make sure that institutions were properly welcoming students and their student experience generally, including housing. The recognized institution model that was announced a couple of weeks ago is something that is going to evolve over the next few months, with including metrics to measure how institutions welcome students and specifically provide them housing. And to the extent they get recognized, which we expect a large number to do, they will benefit from potentially expedited visa processing. So it's only the first step in really doing our jobs federally, but also making sure provinces that have the primary responsibility on designated learning institutions are doing their jobs to crack down on institutions that are simply fraudulent or giving false hope to students that really aren't here to study, but to do something else, and primarily for some bad actors to take money off people that are very vulnerable.
Do you expect pushback from provinces on that?
I expect it, but I welcome it from those that haven't been doing their jobs. I think a lot of the provinces have been very cooperative in recognizing that there is a challenge. It has been very, very lucrative for provinces and a number of institutions, private institutions as well. But this is short-term game with a lot of long-term pain associated to it, so we have to reverse that curve.
When do you expect to have some of those policies in place?
Well, we've already got so, as you know, we announced a couple of weeks ago the first brushstroke in the federal government's responsibility. We expect federally to do more work on our own, but we also expect provinces to look at some of the Auditor General's reports that have been issued against their ministries and implement a number of those recommendations. So,
there's time to do that in time for like the next school year. I mean, the biggest one is in September, right?
I would expect that over the course of the year, some of the provinces that haven't been doing a good job take a real hard look at their inner mechanisms and shore them up. Yeah.
I'm glad that there will be a little bit relief, but I think it is really very important that we work towards like a complete ceasefire. We have lost close to 13,000 innocent Palestinian families, and it's really very horrifying to see all those images which are coming out of Gaza. But these 4 days, I heard that about 50 hostages will be released and some prisoners will be released, and about some humanitarian aid will be able to get in. It's really horrifying to even imagine what's the situation in the hospital. So I really want that Canada should work towards to make sure that Canada has a strong voice to call for a complete ceasefire.
Do you know if Canada is involved in helping in any capacity with either the negotiations or the evacuations of these individuals, or getting more humanitarian aid in?
Canada has announced money for the humanitarian aid, and I hope some humanitarian aid will be able to get into Canada, into Gaza, because Gaza is totally under siege, and I think it's really very important that we work towards a complete ceasefire, because that's how only there will be a relief to the Palestinian families. Like, I'm hearing horrified stories, like 2 days ago, one of my constituents lost his 24-year-old daughter. It's really very sad.
The Prime Minister has had a couple of events disrupted by protesters who are clearly quite emotional about what's going on. Do you think that the anger against the government of this will this help? Is this sort of a progress against that, or do you think that the government can't recover from this?
I think it's really very important that we hammer what I think, I've been hearing from my constituents, I've been hearing from the Muslim community that they want Canada to be a strong coherent ceasefire, calling for a ceasefire, and I think Canada should continue that.
Yeah, I think this is a really important breakthrough in the conflict. I'm glad to see that hostages are going to be released. It's a relief. I also think it's incredibly important that this is going to lead to much-needed humanitarian aid that's going to flow over a period of time. I think at the same time, there are serious security concerns that remain for Israel, and I hope that Hamas will release hostages as soon as possible in order for us to bring further breakthroughs to the conflict.
Do you think this is the beginning of the end of this particular?
Oh, that's impossible to me. I hope so, though.
Is 4 days enough?
What is your reaction to the Conservatives voting against the Ukraine free trade agreement?
No, it's completely absurd. I don't believe Canadians buy into their arguments. To be frank, we've been steadfast in our support of Ukraine. We're seeing how much Ukrainians are on the battlefield, defending their freedom and fighting for ours. And now you see Poilievre playing shenanigans, trying to get small political points out of this. This is absurd.
Mr. Poilievre is accusing your government of imposing the carbon tax on Ukraine.
Mr. Poilievre should get his act together and support Ukraine.
J'aimerais vous entendre peut-être
Yeah.
sur l'Inde avec le complot de juillet. Est-ce que vous en avez entendu parler de la part de votre homologue américain?
Sur la question de l'Inde, j'ai eu plusieurs conversations avec mon homologue américain. Il va de soi que nous en appelons encore et toujours à ce que l'Inde coopère avec nos forces de l'ordre, parce qu'il va de soi que c'est important que la lumière soit faite sur cette question. Nous avons toujours été clairs. Il y a des allégations crédibles comme quoi il y aurait eu, de la part d'agents étrangers, une implication dans le meurtre d'un Canadien ici au Canada. Alors, dans les circonstances, nous allons continuer de travailler avec l'Inde sur ces questions.
Qu'est-ce que ça en dit sur justement le fait qu'ici au Canada, on avait déjà dénoncé ces allégations-là? Est-ce que vous sentez que ça peut peut-être donner un appui à toute cette affaire?
Bien, je vais laisser les forces de l'ordre et le système de justice américain faire son travail.
Minister,
Yes.
how do you react to reports that American law enforcement foiled a plot to kill a Sikh activist in the United States?
Yeah, I was just at that question in French. So first and foremost, we respect the American legal system. We respect also the work of their law enforcement agencies. On our side, what we expect from India is full cooperation in the investigation that our own law enforcement agencies are undertaking, and I'll continue to engage with my Indian counterpart on different diplomatic issues.
Est-ce que le Canada pourrait accueillir des réfugiés palestiniens éventuellement?
Notre objectif présentement est de faire en sorte à ce que les Canadiens qui sont toujours coincés à Gaza puissent revenir au Canada. C'est quelque chose sur lequel mon équipe et moi, on travaille 24/7. Il y a environ 200 Canadiens qui sont encore pris au piège à Gaza. Et donc, nous travaillons avec les autorités israéliennes et égyptiennes pour faire en sorte de les amener. Les questions se poseront plus tard à savoir comment on peut aider les civils palestiniens, mais présentement, ma principale priorité est vraiment de pouvoir m'assurer que les Canadiens puissent quitter Gaza. Thank you.
I have one thing.
Yeah.
I want to say, on the minister's behalf this morning, I met with 2 members of parliament from Ukraine, and they talked about the importance of the free trade agreement as a building block for the reestablishment of Ukraine and the economy after this. These members of parliament are in town today. They are assertively speaking about the progressive nature of our free trade agreement and the importance of it, and their disappointment in the failure of the other party. I just want to make sure that you know that this is a Ukrainian issue. They are strongly supportive and extremely happy with the Minister and the Minister of Trade's work on a progressive trade agreement. They had a price on pollution. It's been there since, I think, 2011. It is absolutely a false narrative that Mr. Poilievre is using. Absolutely a false narrative with respect to the price on pollution. It is already embedded in Ukraine, and they're welcoming it. Just wanted to add that part from the meeting I had this morning.
Thank you.
You've then had an opportunity to kind of speak to the Conservative Labour critic about Bill C-58. What have you heard from the critic, or the sense of the Conservatives' perhaps openness, if there is any openness for them to support this piece of legislation?
Yeah, I have a good relationship with Chris Lewis. We were texting back and forth, haven't talked to him lately. We sent over our senior officials to brief the Conservative caucus on replacement worker legislation. One staffer showed up for 10 minutes. So I don't know what to read into that. We would like to make it. We would like to have unanimous consent in the same way that we had paid sick leave, but I don't know. We're there.
Are you going to be?
They surprised all of us last night on Ukrainian free trade, so I don't know where they are.
Are you going to be seeking unanimous consent from the House when the debate begins on this?
Well, I think the argument speaks for itself. We've got support from other parties. I feel confident. But I would like to have unanimous support, but I think it wins on its merits. So, we'll see where they go.
What do you think of the Conservatives voting against the free trade deal? Sorry, on the bloc, I think they're a bit concerned about the 18-month delay in terms of getting the legislation implemented. I know you said you spoke to the Industrial Relations Board. This is kind of needed, but have you had any conversations with them about it?
Yeah, no, and we got back to them, and we said, the same thing that, that they told us, and they told the NDP as well. When we say that this is the biggest change to collective bargaining in generations, it's true. And so the people, the Canada Industrial Relations Board, the people who helped put this together, the ones who eventually referee, they looked at us and said, we need 18 months. We need 18 months for resources. We need 18 months to retrain. It completely changes the dynamic of the negotiating table.
Once you told the bloc that, did they kind of address their concerns?
I think so, yes. I think so, because, and I was very candid with the NDP, as were my officials. We aren't just doing this for the sake of, we think we need, and kind of government inertia. We need 18 months. This is a big deal. And the NDP, and I think the Bloc, have spent enough, there are enough people there who have spent time at the negotiating table themselves to understand that this is a fundamental change. And so they give the CIRB the benefit of the doubt on this.
Mr. Poilievre this morning is kind of turning the tables. We're asking about replacement worker legislation. He said, well, look at the government's allowing replacement workers to come in by a bunch of foreign nationals in South Korea, going to come take some jobs in Windsor. What do you make of that characterization? And some concerns from politicians and others about why are there foreign nationals involved in a plant that's heavily subsidized, and those jobs, arguably, many people would like to see go to Canadian workers.
It's one heck of a pivot. That one argument we will deal with. I think there were 4 ministers out here yesterday just to show that we are all dealing with this and take it very seriously. I was in Windsor myself. Last week I spoke to union leaders there. I said we are determined, especially after the investments that we have made, that Canadian work be done by Canadian workers. There's room for a certain amount of training and that sort of thing, but Canadian work will be done by Canadian workers. I told union leadership that last week.
How many workers do you expect to come from South Korea under the FTA to work in Windsor?
I don't know, but I know that we want to keep it a minimal amount. We want Canadian workers holding these jobs.
The South Korean ambassador told the Windsor police we can expect up to 1,600 workers. Is that in any ways accurate?
I don't know, mainly because it's out of my jurisdiction. I'm happy to play as a liaison between my provincial counterpart in Ontario, who I have a good relationship with, and we've been texting back and forth on that, and making sure that my colleagues here who have jurisdiction over these sorts of things are doing the work, and they are. All of us are working together on this. In fact, our officials were working together all weekend on it.
And can we get your reaction to the Conservatives voting against that free trade deal with Ukraine? Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says this is about the carbon tax, imposing that on Ukraine. What is your reaction?
It's appalling. It's utterly appalling. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what they're doing. This is a democracy that is fighting the battle for democracy right now against an autocratic regime. This is a deal they negotiated for their economic development, and they're playing. I don't know what they're doing. I think there's more up here than petty politics or than trying to hang this on a carbon tax argument. This is really spooky. I don't know what they're doing. But it scares me, to be honest with you, and I'll fight them tooth and nail on it. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, which was voted on yesterday. The Conservatives voted against. Is a good agreement for Canada's economy, but it's also essential to Ukraine's economy and to helping Ukraine rebuild after their victory. So yesterday the Conservatives voted against this. By voting against this, they're voting against a deal that's great for Canadians, but they're also voting against Ukraine. And this is part of a larger pattern of behavior by the Conservatives, where they don't support Ukraine. Pierre Poilievre, since becoming leader, has never advocated for military, humanitarian, or financial support for Ukraine. He's refused to call out Russia's acts of genocide against Ukraine. He perpetuates false narratives about the war, including things like the war doesn't affect us. He argues that the war doesn't affect inflation, when we know the war is the primary reason for food and energy price inflation around the world, including here at home. It's very clear yesterday's vote is just another example that the Pierre Poilievre Conservatives don't support Ukraine.
You say this is a good deal for Ukraine. Why is that? Because Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader says you are pushing the carbon tax on Ukraine.
So first of all, Ukraine's already signed on to having a carbon tax because Ukraine has to do that to be a member of the EU, and the EU already has carbon pricing in place. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Ukraine negotiated this deal with Canada, and President Zelensky and his government have asked MPs in our parliament to vote to support this agreement. So this is clearly something that's good for Ukraine. So it's really, really important to remember that. The Ukrainian-Canadian Congress has asked that all MPs support this agreement. And so let's remember that the carbon tax language that's in the agreement doesn't require Ukraine to do anything. It's just a commitment to work to fight climate change, which we should all be able to get behind. To me, the argument that Poilievre is using about the carbon tax in the agreement is a red herring. It's really just an excuse to not vote for the agreement. The reality is this is a critical agreement for, and if you think about the reason this is so important to Ukraine, is because this agreement, the current free trade agreement with Ukraine, only covers goods, the trade of goods between Canada and Ukraine. This will cover services, and it will also cover investment. And if Ukraine is going to rebuild, it's going to need hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. This is an excellent way to facilitate Canadians investing in Ukraine. And by blocking this, Pierre Poilievre and his Conservative MPs are blocking the rebuild of Ukraine, and they're blocking Ukraine's economic recovery.
How concerned are you about public support waning for supporting Ukraine?
Well, I think people like Pierre Poilievre are contributing to that, to the extent there is. I think most Canadians are strongly in support of Ukraine and Ukraine's decisive victory. But I am concerned about the false narrative that Pierre Poilievre perpetuates when he argues that the war doesn't affect us, that doesn't affect inflation around the world, when we know it does. It concerns me when he argues, he votes against a free trade agreement that's good for Canada and good for Ukraine, critical for Ukraine really at this time, by using red herring arguments about carbon tax language that we know doesn't require Ukraine to do anything that is counter to their interests or to Canada's interests. I think at the end of the day, what this vote shows is that the Poilievre Conservatives don't support Ukraine. They voted unanimously against the free trade agreement that President Zelensky, the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, everyone is asking all of us to support at a critical time for Ukraine.
What about your government's own financial support for Ukraine? Because in the financial update that was posted yesterday, it shows that there will be a decrease over time for financial support for Ukraine. Are you disappointed by that? What do you think of that move?
Look, I think Canada's been one of the leading countries in supporting Ukraine. I think empirically that's true. Anybody who looks at what we've done knows that that's true. We've provided approximately $10 billion in support for Ukraine. We're the leading country per capita in financial support. So grants and loans to Ukraine. We provided about $2 billion worth of military aid. We've trained almost 40,000 members of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So think about that. 40,000 Ukrainian Armed Forces members who are fighting on the front line were trained by Canada. And we've done so much more in humanitarian aid and diplomatically. This Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement is something that Ukraine asked us to do. And Canada had agreed to negotiate this quickly, modernize that agreement. And this agreement was signed by President Zelensky and Prime Minister Trudeau when President Zelensky was here in Ottawa on September 22nd. So I really think that Canada's support for Ukraine has been the strongest in the world. That said, we have to continue supporting them. We have to continue to provide more support. It won't be enough until Ukraine has a decisive victory. And so, to answer your question, we'll have to continue to provide support until Ukraine wins.
But can this support be infinite? Because, I mean, we're in a very tight financial situation now, and Canadians are looking at all the money going to Ukraine, and some people are wondering, why the government is spending so much money when, Canadians are dealing with financial issues in their own household right now.
Yeah. That's an important question. And people in the Etobicoke Centre in my community are struggling with those same challenges, with the cost of living especially. And I think what's important, to remember is that this war isn't just about Ukraine and Ukraine's sovereignty and freedom. It is. And those are good reasons to support the Ukrainian people. But this war is having global consequences and consequences here at home. And as I said, this war is the primary reason for food and energy inflation around the world. So when we go to the grocery store and my constituents see higher prices, the main reason for that is Russia's blockades of Ukrainian agricultural exports. Ukraine produces a significant amount of food that gets exported around the world. And this is about our security as well. If Russia were to win, this would pose a much greater risk to our security and to the security of our allies around the world. So if we want to stop inflation, Ukraine needs to win the war. If we want to secure our own sovereignty and security, Ukraine needs to win the war. And so, from my perspective, We either pay a small price now by helping the Ukrainians win this war decisively, or we pay a much bigger price later in much higher inflation, much greater security risks in the years to come, here in Canada and around the world. Thank you. Thank you, William.
Où est-ce que vous en êtes en ce moment?
Bien, comme vous savez, je les ai convoqués à Ottawa. Ils sont venus ici, le président et 3 vice-présidents. Je leur ai fait comprendre que c'est inacceptable, ce qui est arrivé. Ils le reconnaissent, par ailleurs, et ils travaillent sur un plan. On doit les reparler en début de décembre.
Comment est le français de M. Rousseau, justement? Est-ce que vous avez parlé en français à M. Rousseau? Comment est son français?
Pas mal l'anglais.
Ah, il parle pas en français?
C'est quoi vos attentes?
Pas mal l'anglais.
C'est quoi vos attentes particulières par rapport à
Mais il y a plusieurs personnes qui parlent français. Pardon?
C'est quoi vos attentes particulières par rapport au plan qu'ils vont vous présenter?
Bien, je m'attends, avec tous les passagers soient respectés avec dignité et respect. 2, qu'il y ait toujours l'équipement nécessaire. 3, qu'il y ait une meilleure formation pour que les agents de bord et autres employés puissent faire leur travail comme il faut.
But this keeps happening at Air Canada. People who have wheelchairs keep breaking. So is your message not getting across? Did they not care enough? And what are you conveying to them?
Well, what do you want me to watch? So, again, as, I summoned them to Ottawa. So the president was there, the CEO, and 3 vice presidents. I told them what happened was unacceptable, and they have to treat everyone with dignity and respect. There are simple things can do, for example, to help that person to sit before others come in. That would be a nice change. Making sure that there's enough equipment when needed and that the training is there to support the people that need help.
But it seems to happen repeatedly on Air Canada that people who do have accessibility issues take their wheelchairs, they get broken, Air Canada doesn't do anything to help them.
Yes.
So why is this
I
repeatedly happening?
asked them to look at that, what's possible, and if in some cases it's possible to have the wheelchair on inside the plane.
Minister, can I ask about the C-33? The NDP and the Conservatives seem really opposed to it. They don't like it. They say no one can really point to someone in ports or shipping that really support it. Like, is it time to go back to the drawing board?
No, I'm having very productive discussions with the NDP and the Bloc. Actually, at this moment, they brought some amendments. We're discussing that, and I think we'll be able to move forward soon. Thank you. Merci tout le monde.
Monsieur Rodriguez, à Québec, qu'est-ce que vous en pensez? 7 millions.
Là, je vais commencer à patiner, là.
Les frais de carte de crédit.
Oui.
Vous en pensez quoi? Êtes-vous à l'aise avec ça? Il y avait des gens qui se posent des questions. Ça va coûter au-dessus de 350 millions en 6 ans. La dette canadienne. Vous en pensez quoi?
Bien, c'est qu'on a dû être présent, on doit continuer d'être présent. Alors, les investissements d'hier sont ciblés pour venir en aide aux gens qui en ont vraiment besoin, tout en faisant attention de ne pas contribuer à l'inflation.
Mais que ça coûte plus cher que la santé. Là.
Mais vous avez vu aussi qu'il y a des investissements qui viennent vraiment en aide à du monde qui en a besoin. Et on ne va pas abandonner ces gens-là. Mais en même temps, on s'attend à avoir la plus grande croissance des pays du G7. Ouais? En même temps, le ratio dette PIB est parmi les meilleurs au monde et les dettes déficit également. Déficit. Donc, c'est pas une situation économique qui est facile. Elle n'est pas chez nous, mais elle n'est pas nulle part ailleurs. Et le gouvernement doit gérer de façon prudente, mais aussi être là pour ceux qui ont besoin.
Merci.
Vu qu'on avance dans les sondages.
Vous en pensez quoi?
Vous pensez de la décision du gouvernement du Québec d'amener les Kings de Los Angeles au Colisée?
Votre collègue a déjà posé la même question hier.
Mais M. Girard persiste et signe, là. C'est une bonne décision, même s'il y a des milliers de professeurs et d'infirmiers dans les rues.
Alors, 2 choses là-dessus. La première, c'est que le hockey, ça m'intéresse. La deuxième chose, c'est que cette question-là relève du gouvernement du Québec. Et je vais leur laisser le soin d'en parler et d'en discuter.
Son calcul de probabilité, qu'est-ce que vous en dites? Est-ce qu'il a bien fait ses calculs avec son 10
Ayant déjà enseigné les probabilités, effectivement, son 10 semble fonctionner. Maintenant, est-ce que les hypothèses sont bonnes? Ça, c'est à lui de les justifier.
Est-ce que des fonds publics devraient être dépensés pour amener une équipe de hockey à Québec?
Bon, vous savez que chacun fait sa job et M. Girard va faire sa job, il va continuer à défendre sa
Vous êtes un homme de chiffres. Est-ce que vous êtes à l'aise, vous, avec les gros déficits, particulièrement avec tout ce que ça va coûter pour payer la dette? 350 milliards de dollars sur 6 ans, juste en intérêt.
Il y a ce que ça coûte, mais aussi ce que ça rapporte. Et ce qu'on sait présentement, c'est que pour les ménages de la classe moyenne, se loger, ça coûte très cher. Puis on sait que la façon de résoudre ce problème, c'est davantage de construction, y compris au Québec. Au Québec, on a un rythme de construction présentement qui est inférieur à ce qu'on devrait voir et qui est inférieur à ce qu'on voit dans certaines autres provinces. La bonne nouvelle, c'est qu'il y a au Québec une capacité de construire davantage de logements qui est très substantielle et le budget, l'énoncé économique d'hier est là pour l'appuyer. Dans le logement social et communautaire, qu'on a absolument besoin de développer au Québec encore davantage, mais aussi dans le logement locatif. Alors, les annonces d'hier...
Avez-vous l'impression qu'il n'y a rien dans l'immédiat?
Là, j'ajoute à ça parce qu'effectivement, il y a déjà 25 milliards de dollars qui, dans les 2 à 3 prochaines années, vont être épuisés. Mais il faut déjà préparer la suite parce que les promoteurs immobiliers, eux, regardent vers l'avenir. Ils ont besoin d'avoir un peu de certitude par rapport au financement qui sera disponible dans 2 à 3 ans. Ça prend généralement 5 ans avant de mettre en place un projet de développement locatif significatif. Fait que le fait qu'on ait plus de prévisibilité à plus long terme, c'est une très bonne nouvelle pour les développeurs, y compris dans ma région. Je sais que dans ma région, il y a de très gros développeurs qui ont suivi l'annonce d'hier avec grand intérêt.
Concernant la charte des banques, est-ce qu'on a l'impression que ça, c'est sur base volontaire que tout ça va se faire? Quelles sont les chances véritablement que vous en arriviez à des ententes satisfaisantes avec les banques dans ce dossier-là?
Bien, je pense que les banques comprennent qu'on est tous dans la même équipe. On a tous intérêt à faire notre job. Le secteur bancaire est un secteur traditionnellement assez conservateur. Mais dans le monde actuel, il faut être plutôt engagé. Il faut s'assurer que les gens pour lesquels on travaille, les familles qui ont une hypothèque, aient l'appui dont ils ont besoin pour continuer à payer leur hypothèque au cours des prochaines années et protéger à la fois leurs finances et celles du secteur bancaire.
Est-ce que le gouvernement devrait se doter d'un plan pour équilibrer le budget?
Bien, nous, notre objectif, c'est de faire ce que tous les économistes disent, c'est de réduire à travers le temps le rapport de la dette au produit intérieur brut. Tous les économistes, dont je fais encore partie, disent que c'est ça l'objectif, parce que ça tient compte de la dette, mais ça tient compte aussi de la capacité de rembourser de la dette qui est le produit intérieur brut. Lorsque les investissements font croître l'économie, ça améliore la capacité des gouvernements de rembourser cette dette dans le futur. C'est la même chose pour une famille ou pour un couple. Si votre revenu double et que votre hypothèque augmente de 50 bien, vous êtes davantage capable de rembourser l'hypothèque.
Donc, pas nécessairement ce que vous nous expliquez.
Bien, l'objectif à nouveau, c'est de faire en sorte qu'on continue, par rapport à tous les autres pays du G7, à avoir le meilleur ratio de dette par rapport au PIB et que ce ratio diminue à travers le temps.
Avez-vous encore les moyens de payer le plan que demandent les néo-démocrates sur l'assurance médicaments?
Bien, ça relève des discussions entre mon collègue, le ministre de la Santé et le
11 milliards par année.
C'est une discussion qui continue. M. Singh l'a déjà mentionné. C'est un agenda important sur lequel travaillent mon collègue et mes collègues du NPD. Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Once the Americans apparently thwarted the attempted assassination of a 6th separatist, just wondering, how is the Canadian community doing just after a few weeks, still a few months out from Trudeau-Legacy accusations?
Look, I think as Canadians and Canadians in general in Surrey and other places are concerned about the allegations, the serious allegations, and they're really looking for results. So hoping that the RCMP and the law enforcement come out with charges to whoever's responsible for this as soon as possible.
And especially back in September, we saw a lot of tension among Sikh and Hindu communities. Has that tapered off at all, or is it still...
I think that's made up. There's actually no tension between Sikh and Hindus in Canada. They actually coexist really well. They attend each other's festivities. We just had Diwali. Diwali was a great celebration, and everyone, both Sikhs, Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, all celebrated. And in a place like Surrey, they all celebrated it together. So I think that's a made-up concept by some groups that are trying to divide the community. In Canada, I think both communities live really well together and are very harmonious.
These reports out of the States, does that change anything with the notion that potentially another extrajudicial killing attempt happened just with our southern neighbor?
It does concern us, definitely, that if it is the allegations that were made by the Prime Minister here in Canada that they heard, if the same is being done in the U.S., then that's something India has to look at very seriously, and the democratic worlds have to put India into check to make sure this doesn't happen around the globe.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
Concernant l'extradition de mafieux italiens, donc vous avez parlé avec votre homologue d'Italie il y a quelques semaines. Oui. Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire par rapport à ça?
Avec les cas concernant l'extradition, c'est extrêmement confidentiel, donc je ne suis pas capable de vous expliquer exactement ce qu'on a discuté. On a discuté le sujet, on a une collaboration très étroite avec le ministre Nordio et avec le pays d'Italie. C'est un allié dans le G7. Donc, c'est effectivement tout ce que je peux mentionner maintenant.
Mais c'est des procédures qui datent de longtemps?
Mais effectivement, le processus d'extradition, ça date de longtemps, évidemment. Et c'est sûr qu'il y a des choses qu'on peut faire pour améliorer la situation, mais concernant les dossiers comme tels, je ne peux pas... Je ne peux pas expliquer.
Mais on parle de combien de gens à peu près?
Pardon?
On parle de combien de personnes environ?
Je ne peux même pas expliquer combien de personnes parce que c'est une communication entre les deux États et c'est une communication extrêmement confidentielle.
Et si jamais ça va se produire, si jamais il y a extradition, ça va être public, ça va être annoncé?
Dernière question.
Vis-à-vis de la situation est extrêmement confidentielle à tous les États. Merci.
OK. Merci.